Hello, I'm Evan with New Life for Old Bikes. In today's episode, we're going to service the 3-speed hub on my 1975 Takara 3-speed touring bike. The particular hub on this bike is a Shimano. Before we remove the wheel from the bike, we need to loosen the barrel adjuster. It simply unscrews counterclockwise. The next part we need to remove is the bell crank. Underneath the bell crank is a rod you'll need to remove. Lastly, remove the nut. Now we can simply loosen the nuts and remove the wheel from the back of the bike. I'd much rather deal with grease than rust. At this point, I'm simply going to scrape off the grease and then clean it with a little bit of mineral spirits. As of 2 nights ago, I'd never disassembled a 3-speed hub before. I always just serviced the bearings and added oil. Unfortunately, this one doesn't have a place to add oil, so I have disassembled and reassembled this one several times so I could feel comfortable showing you how to do it. The first thing we're going to do is remove the lock nut that holds the bell crank in place. Once we have that off, we're going to remove the nut that holds the wheel on the bike. Underneath the nut is this little gizmo right here. If you notice, there's a tab on it. This tab locks into the frame and prevents the axle from turning in your bicycle. Next, I want you to notice that there's a lock ring. This holds the rear gear on. And what we're going to do is we're going to get underneath it and lift it up. And we're going to walk it off the wheel. Next we can remove the gear, and there's a cover. The next thing I'd like you to notice, that there's a flat spot on the axle right in front of the lock nut. I'm going to take a wrench and grab that flat spot. In this case, I'm using a crescent wrench because that's what was handy. And then I'm going to loosen the lock nut and remove it. Underneath the lock nut is a cone, and I'm going to unscrew that as well. The cone, by the way, is 15 millimeter. Underneath the cone, I'm going to pull out the gear cluster. And then a set of outer bearings. Flip the wheel over, and we're going to take a cone wrench, which is nothing more than a very narrow wrench, and we're going to put it onto the cone to keep that in place. That, by the way, is 15 millimeter, and I'm taking a 17 millimeter wrench and I'm loosening the lock nut. Then I'm removing the cone. Underneath that is a spring. Once you have the cone ring, the spring, and the nut off, simply drop the rest of the axle out of the wheel. From here, there are 2 pins that need to be removed. Right here, and there's one on the inside. One side of this pin is rounded and one side has a cutout. The cutout always goes toward the inside. There's one on each side. The inside one fell out. This requires a special tool to disassemble, but fortunately, as you can see, everything we need to get to can be cleaned and serviced without actually disassembling it. I'm going to drop this into some mineral spirits and clean it up real well, and then we're going to add oil and put this thing back together. On the bearings, I want you to notice that there's this little ring around the outside which you can pry out if you need to get at them to clean them. However, I was more afraid of damaging the ring than not getting all the dirt. So I left it in and cleaned it with a toothbrush. I believe that looks really good. The other thing I want you to notice is the only thing that's holding these tabs in, or pawls, is a snap ring, and reality is you could just pop that off of there and clean them thoroughly. I was able to slide them out of the way with a screwdriver and simply clean them with a toothbrush. The last thing I did was spray a little canned air into all the crevices just to make sure I got all the mineral spirits out. That one came out. But as you can see, all you have to do is slide it back up under the ring and it works just fine. All I've done here is fill the race with grease so the bearings never run dry. Again, just make sure to fill the race with grease. Make sure you take a drop of oil and put it on each of the gears. We want these to run nice and smoothly. I'm using 30 weight synthetic motor oil. Also make sure you put a drop of grease on each of the pawls so that they move smoothly. Very good. Next, I wanted to point out to you there's a flat spot on the axle here. That goes out on the drive side. There's a slot right here, and each of these pins goes into the slot. There's two of them. What I'm going to do is put a little bit of grease on the pin to keep it in place. Actually, I'm going to put it on the axle. The rounded edge goes toward the flat spots on the axle. There, that ought to stay in place. This open section goes toward the drive side of the bike, and if you'll notice, the gears inside there will mesh with these slots. Once you have that down, put another dab of grease on the other side and put the pin. And remember, the curved side goes toward the outside. This is now ready to go in the wheel. Next, from the drive side opening, drop the gear set in and just hold the pawls so it engages. Flip the wheel over to the non-drive side of the bike, and then we're going to put the spring in. There's one side is wider than the other. The wider side goes down. Next, we're going to put the bearing cup on the non-drive side. This side is fixed, so if you put it all the way down, just back it up a tiny little bit and then put the lock nut on. There we go. Snug the lock ring. Next, we're going to drop the bearings in with the race up. And this piece goes in. You'll need a small screwdriver to push the poles in so that it slides down in place. Next, the bearing cone goes in and gets snugged up. And then the lock nut. Before you go any further, make sure that your bearings turn smoothly. Next, we're going to put the cover on. Then we're putting our gear on. In this case, the rounded section goes down on this particular one. Yours might be different. Last, we put on the snap ring, and we're done. Before we put the wheel on the bike, remember to put this little gizmo in place. That tab goes up. It engages with the frame. Then we put the nut on. And the last thing, we put on the small lock nut. Now we're ready to install this on the bicycle. I'm going to go ahead and pull this off so I can show you the little slot here and that little gizmo that needs to slide into the slot. The little gizmo that I showed you that fits on the wheel, the tab goes in here. and it just simply prevents the axle from turning. Just make sure it's lined up. Very good. Let's put the lock nut back on. Next, we're going to put the rod back in. And then the ball crank. Turn it till it seats. Once it seats, back it up just a little bit so that it's straight with the cable, and tighten the lock nut on there. There we go. Next, screw in your barrel adjuster. Make sure the cable for the shifter goes underneath this jockey wheel. Next, shift the bike into second gear, and notice there's a red N and a line in this right here. Make sure you tighten that up so that it is perfectly centered, and second gear should be correct. There we go. Just a quick note here. The sprocket or gear should be turning at the same speed as the wheel in second gear. And it does. In first gear, the sprocket should rotate faster. And it does. And in third gear, the sprocket should rotate slower than the wheel. So we are correct. Thank you for watching my video. I hope you learned something. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments below. And don't forget, like and subscribe.